Hello and welcome. I'm Anna Danziger-Halprin, Associate Director of the Center for Women's History here at New York Historical Society. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to thank Louise Muir, our President and CEO, Agnes Shu-Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and Pam Schaffler, our Chair Emerita, as well as all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Jean Margot Reed, Diane Max and the late Adam Max, the Mellon Foundation, our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical would be possible without your continued and committed support. As the Associate Director of our Center for Women's History, I'm proud of the growth we've achieved here at the Center since opening only a few short years ago. Our scholarship, education, programs, collecting, and not least of all, exhibitions, all foreground women's critical roles in American history. Tonight's program, Reporting in the Civil War Era, will run for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. At any time during our program tonight, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature located on your screen, and we will answer as many questions as we can. And now I'm delighted to introduce our panel for the evening. Susan Stanfield is an assistant professor of history at the University of Texas at El Paso, where she teaches classes on the 19th century US. She is author of Rewriting Citizenship, Women, Race, and 19th Century Print Culture, and is working on her next book that deals with baking and women's activism during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. She's the host of Pod Textualizing the Past, a wide-ranging history podcast. Joshua Brown is a professor of history emeritus and former director of the CUNY Graduate Center's American Social History Project. He is the author of Beyond the Lines, The Pictorial Press, Everyday Life, and the Crisis of Gilded Age America, and he has written widely about the history of U.S. visual culture. He is the visual editor of the noted print and online textbook, Who Built America? Brown's cartoons and illustrations appear online and in print. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, an NEH, and American Council of Learned Societies grantee. And Brown is writing a history of the Civil War's visual culture. And Kathleen McCarthy is a professor of history at the Graduate Center at CUNY and directs the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And lucky for us, a member of our Center for Women's History Scholarly Advisory Board. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago. She's a scholar of American Creed, Philanthropy, and the Rise of Civil Society, 1700 to 1865. Women's Culture, American Philanthropy and Art, 1830 to 1930, and other books and articles on national and international philanthropy, and has lectured on these topics worldwide. Dr. McCarthy has been a visiting research fellow with the Rockefeller Foundation, a consultant to the Ford Foundation, and president of the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action. She is currently working on a book on women, power, and money from the first Gilded Age to the second. We are so thrilled to have Susan, Josh, and Kathleen with us this evening. I will now turn the conversation over to Kathleen to get things started.
Thank you, Anna, and many thanks to everyone who organized tonight's salon and the New York Historical Society's exhibition on Carol Walker, Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, annotated, which inspired tonight's session. As Walker points out, stories matter, whether told through images or on the printed page or now through social media. They shape our values. They shape our collective memories. They shape our ideas about what matters, our notions of citizenship and of national purpose. They shape who will be seen and whose voices will be heard. The exhibition focuses on prints in Harper's 2-volume Pictorial History of the Civil War, which was published in the late 1860s. It also underscores the invisibility of African Americans in Harper's telling, and the stereotypes that help to justify that invisibility. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the power of the press in 19th century America. Part of our conversation will focus on major print and pictorial journals such as Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, which was like the Newsweek or Time of the 19th century. I hope I have that right, Josh.
Mhm.
And we'll also be looking at the role of more specialized publications in helping women and African Americans to claim a place on the public stage. But first, let's start by talking about how all of this evolved. How did the print media develop and change from the antebellum period to the post-war era? And Josh, why don't we start with you and then we'll move to Susan.
Sure. First, I'd like to thank the Center for Women's History and the New York Historical Society for this chance to participate in this. I anticipate will be a wonderful conversation. The Civil War, to some extent, it could be argued that the Civil War was in part, let's say, stimulated by the rise of magazines, and particularly national magazines, in the mid-19th century. There were, between 1850 and 1865, some 2,500 magazines, mainly in the North, that were introduced. To be sure, a good chunk of them lasted no more than 4 years, deeply affected by the several depressions that took place from 1837 to 1857 to 1877, et cetera. The technological changes played a large part in this, in the sense that it became much cheaper to produce publications at that period of time due to the innovations in paper production, the rise of fast steam-operated printing presses, of course, much cheaper mail costs, and reproduction technology that had not existed earlier. I should say that some of the things that we'll probably consider are also not publications in the classical sense, but independent, for example, images, lithographs, and engravings, which were really introduced in the United States early in the 19th century and really took off during this period.
Great. Josh, you're doing your slides now?
Oh. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that the kinds of innovations that you're talking about are quite expensive. The introduction of things like steam presses. And during this period, before and immediately after the war, Harper's and Leslie's were run and staffed almost entirely by white men. But other groups had their own journals as well. How did they differ? I mean, men had better access to credit, certainly, but Susan, do you want to, just before we get into Amelia Bloomer, which seems absolutely perfect, would you like to say a little bit about the journals run or the publications run by women and African Americans and how they developed? Were
Yes.
they on the same par? Did they have big steam presses and large staffs?
Well, I mostly research the antebellum period,
Mhm.
but there was some the press became a lot easier for women and people of color to utilize. I think the way that they got started, there were some books that were published by women, but really in the 1820s and 1830s, and really ending, at the Civil War, when it took off even more, they were able to work a couple of different ways. So some authors, such as Lydia Maria Child or Sarah Hale, published in the 1820s and had their novels. Then women started looking at other ways to reach out to an audience. And so there was an emergence of cookbooks and domestic manuals, and they really also take off in the 1830s and 1840s. And so you have the books that women can buy, but you also have a the emergence of magazines for women and newspapers that tended to be either for women, such as the Lily, or more broadly anti-slavery. And that was a chance for even the everyday woman to get involved in writing. So they didn't have their names attached to, the articles that was signed by, a lady of Philadelphia or a colored lady, but they, even anonymously, they were being published at this time. They also had the opportunity to have their various organizations published in newspapers at the time. So the Female Literary Association, which was an African-American group that was in Philadelphia, had multiple members of the group have their essays published in the Liberator throughout the 1830s. So I think it's kind of nice. It opened publishing to more women than, you would normally think. And it also helped them to become wider read readers. And so they became active that way too.
And a lot of it was tied to social reform, with a perfect lead in right here with a picture of Amelia Bloomer and from her publication, The Lily. Josh, you have some slides. You want to go through them, or do you want to wait?
I was curious about some of the things that Susan just said. I know you have some additional slides, Susan. Did you want to run through them?
I can wait because mine are pretty
sorry. Just in, if you would move 2 slides down, please. Thank you. One thing I should to just raise the technology. I'm mainly a social historian, so technology is not my forte. But in terms of the smaller presses, not the national magazines, but the smaller presses, there is, a huge host of printers. These are not going to be huge steam-operated printing presses that a lot of these smaller publications are being printed. These are, jobbers. There's lots of, if you're talking about the cities in particular, there's lots of, opportunities and ways to basically hire, printers to get small runs done. Anyhow, what I was raising here was just to situate us in terms of the illustrated press. There were, during the Civil War, three illustrated publications, illustrated weeklies. There was Harper's Weekly, which was started in 1857. The Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper, which was really the first viable illustrated newspaper in 1855. And the New York Illustrated News, which began in 1859 and didn't make it through the war and ended in 1864. All of them were modeled on the Illustrated London News, which began in 1842. So there was a huge gap between the British illustrated publications and the American publications. The first one being in 1855. And in fact, Frank Leslie, the founder of his illustrated newspaper, had come from as art supervisor in the Illustrated, London News. There was also, I said, during the Civil War, one weekly illustrated newspaper called the Southern Illustrated News, which, because of paper shortages, because of the Union blockade, ink shortages, you name it, type of shortages, sporadically was published and then ended. It was being published in Richmond, Virginia. Next slide, please. Just to touch on it, and one of the things that we will discuss is, well, what what is the Harper's pictorial history of the Civil War is not representative of the way people saw the war during the war, particularly in the illustrated press. At the time when photography could not yet be reproduced, and certainly could not only not be reproduced, but also could not capture action. Hence, lots of portraits and lots of very still people, or also, unfortunately, dead people. The illustrated newspapers had the capacity to both provide narratives and information about events before, during, and after that the photography could not do. And among them, unlike the Harper's Pictorial, had a fair amount of reporting, visual reporting on African Americans during the war. Harper's Weekly was not particularly, in fact, avoided really taking any position on slavery until, for all intents and purposes, Fort Sumter. And indeed, events basically forced it to eventually recognize that it was not going to be able to continue a Southern market, although some Southerners did read Harper's Weekly. And they became actually, the Harper's Weekly became the unofficial Republican, with a capital R, and Lincoln supporter publication, pictorial publication. So one of these was, in fact, Robert Smalls, who was celebrated in Harper's Weekly for his capture, rather his stealing of a Confederate boat, and along with many of his, fellow enslaved people, and taking the boat to Union forces and going through Charleston Harbor, and he was celebrated in Harper's Weekly. And that was one of a number. And if we go to the next one, we can also see that there was coverage, unlike in the Harper's Pictorial, which had one illustration, if I remember correctly, of Black soldiers, which would not be until after 1863, when African Americans were allowed to join federal forces. It's the only picture there where, for all intents and purposes, African Americans in the pictorial history are passive or in the scenery, or for all intents and purposes, or are absent. And this, however, is one of numerous pictures of, in fact, Black soldiers liberating plantations, which was in Harper's Weekly, as you can see, in 1864. Next, please. There was also, as Thomas Nastor, of course, is famous, probably best known now as as the cartoonist and probably most famous political cartoonist in the 19th century, who brought down the Tweed Ring in New York City in the 1870s. He also then did a good deal of images supporting emancipation and equal rights. He also indulged in stereotypes at the time, but in this case, this picture, which is featured in the New York Historical Society exhibit, is one that is envisioning what life will be after slavery is dissolved. And you can see the juxtaposition of from enslavement on one side to opening schools, voting, all of the aspects of emancipation. Interestingly, in 1865, after Lincoln's assassination, the picture of the devil and the slave in the bottom was replaced by a picture of Abraham Lincoln. Next slide, please. Harper's Weekly was not the only publication a pictorial publication that spent a good deal of time covering African-American troops once they are allowed to fight. This case is in the Battle of Port Hudson in 1863. And one of the aspects about this is about the Illustrated Press is the capacity, and I think this is important to think through or view through 19th century eyes, where we sort of, and this certainly has been my experience and experience of working with students, the tendency is not to examine closely an image when in fact these images were closely viewed by people who were reading the magazine, because among other things, they gained information not only about the narrative of the event and many of the details, whether it's uniforms, whether it's location, but also it was often used, particularly with Black troops, to teach reading. The Illustrated Press was very popular among Black troops because of the capacity to mix text with images. Next, please. And this is just the third of the publications, illustrated publications, was the New York Illustrated News, and that publication also began to celebrate African-American soldiers. In this case, of course, it was a member of the South Carolina Colored Volunteers, the regiment of the capture of a Confederate officer by an African-American soldier. Next, please. Oh, and I think actually I should stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. So you're making a distinction between Harper's attempt to shape historical memory and Harper's treatment of the news, which is very interesting, given some of the things that have been written about African Americans and the memory of the war, particularly David Blight's work, which we'll get to at the end of the session. Susan, you mentioned that there was a market for women's writings in these journals, especially as they began to proliferate. I presume that white women had a far easier time than African-American women, and I was surprised, really kind of floored when you had the statistic in your book that Catherine Sedgwick had made over $6,000 before the Civil War through her writing. John D. Rockefeller, who was a clerk in a mercantile house that during those years was making $500 a year. So at that point, she would have been much richer than Rockefeller, which is amazing. But can you tell me a little bit about any particular constraints that African-American women would have faced in trying to get published? Was it harder for them?
Definitely harder. And I think part of it is the idea that authors, women required a certain amount of fame or importance to become well known. And that tended to just mean white middle class or upper class women. And so when it came to publishing in the anti-slavery press before the war, African-American women did write lots of essays and poetry and things like that. But, even when we think about William Lloyd Garrison's, Liberator, he still kind of created a stereotype. So African-American women were described as, a lady from Philadelphia, stressing that Black women could fulfill the same functions as white women. But they typically didn't use their names. The exception to this was Sarah Mapps Douglas, who constantly published her name in the paper, unlike the average white woman or African-American woman. So, that made it harder. And then when it came to publishing books at the time, it was nearly impossible. So, we're all aware that, Phyllis Wheatley published in the 1770s, but it took until 1840 for Anne Plato to publish her, an African-American woman, to publish her book of essays and poetry. And then, it was 1859 before Harriet Wilson publishes Our Nig. And so, the idea of Black women publishing books just seemed a little more unheard of. So that means that Black women couldn't earn the money that Catherine Sedgwick did, that Sarah Hale could earn, that Catherine Beecher could, because Black women weren't really given the authority or the power to publish books. So they did it very rarely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And they must have had much narrower readership bases as well. If you're comparing the anti-slavery press with Godey's Lady's Book, which had one of the largest circulations of any magazine in the 19th century, there's a big difference. And as I recall, journals like Douglas's North Star had to be subsidized by contributions, by gifts from the African American community and from white abolitionists, whereas Godey's and Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper were primarily, if not exclusively, commercial ventures, right? Right, Josh?
Yeah, and subscription.
Right, right. So, Susan, you've also written about how African Americans and white women use their publications to promote their claims to citizenship and their roles in nation building. Could you say a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I think that one of the things to keep in mind about them claiming citizenship is they're not claiming literal citizenship as we think of today. So, this is, before the 14th Amendment. This is Winkovicher, the idea that women have no legal standing, that once they marry, their husband literally covers their legal standing. And so instead, what they're doing is trying to see, how do they fulfill citizenship culturally? And so cultural citizenship of, how do they fulfill their obligations as citizens? So women would, want to say, I keep a beautiful home where my husband can come home from work and enjoy his time. But more importantly, I am a nation builder, because you have to have homes to build cities, to build communities. And so that is how women, either writing books and novels, so the domestic novels that were very popular at the time, like by Catherine Sedgwick and others. These domestic novels, are basically how to clean a house, but they're fiction, so you have characters and things like that. But then also women publish cookbooks and household training manuals. And so starting with really Catherine Beecher's, that's published in the early 1840s, she writes this crazy long introduction to the role of women facing the nation, and how women create nation building. And it's like 30 pages. And after her book comes out, pretty much all women's cookbooks or domestic manuals include these kinds of arguments of the importance of keeping house. So women claim this cultural citizenship. For white women, it's just how they understand themselves. I think for Black women, it's what they try to sort of seize to claim citizenship, not just for themselves, but kind of for their households. So, a kind of standard, back to Aristotle, view of, citizenship was to be master of a good household. And so Black women also, tried to read these manuals and tried to write essays in the African American press at the time, stressing that they too could do these things. So perhaps their husbands deserve the right to vote because they're good patriarchs, just like white men.
Mhm. And some of the women's reform journals also help to educate women about how the legal system worked, for example, because I remember in the American Female Moral Reform Society's Advocate for Reform, they would track anti-seduction legislation through the various states very carefully. And that also, I think, played a role in educating women about how citizenship worked and what role they could play through petitions and other things in moving along legislation. So it's a fascinating topic. Okay, so what does and doesn't Harper's pictorial history tell us about the Civil War? Josh?
Could we just remove the slide, just since this isn't what the subject, thank you. The war, the pictorial history has a lot of battles, a lot of skirmishes, a lot of campaigns, a lot of portraits of statesmen, and obviously generals and officers, military officers. It's pretty light on women and African Americans. And again, that's fairly surprising in light of what people saw in Harper's Weekly during the war. Aside from the images of African American soldiers that I mentioned earlier, there was coverage of women on the home front supporting the war effort. Women who belonged to the United States Sanitary Commission, which is one of the major private organizations that supported the federal effort. The Christian Commission is another one, and nurses. Some very, very striking one is a NAST a picture of a woman by the bedside of a wounded soldier. And some additional, and I should have mentioned women munition workers in the North. These are all obviously images of Northern women, which is again an absence in 1866 publication, and a pretty surprising one. So we have a vision of the war that is basically battles. Now I have to say, we're talking about the visuals. I can't pretend to have read the entire volume or even a large part of the Guernsey and Allen volume. But it seems from the bit that has come across that that's basically the way it's viewed. I would say there are another thing that is not shown in the book is the home front. The only thing that I remember clearly being shown in the home front is the draft riots in July 1863. Otherwise, there is very little imagery when in fact the home front was a significant part of what the coverage of the war was.
And was there very much on African American women pictorially or in the articles?
The only places that I remember, you're talking about in terms of Harper's Weekly as opposed to the publication. No, not much. I mean, as far as I recall, that there's a lot of, I should say, there is a lot of pictures of events that will include women, whether it is, self-emancipated slaves fleeing to Union lines, or a good example is Fortress Monroe, which was the first place that African Americans ran to Union forces in Virginia at that period of time. The word contraband came out of that based on General Benjamin Butler's understanding that he was going to basically claim that since there was a war going on, he could claim them as basically goods, a sort of dehumanization that plagued African Americans throughout the war. But in terms of what you're asking, in terms of Black women, the most striking image that I recall of a Black woman, aside from, of course, some images of labor camps and supporting the Union forces, is in the burned back of an African American woman who had been boiling water had been thrown on her by a plantation mistress, and this is at the very end of the war when this is shown.
Oh, so they didn't publish images or stories about the African American women who went down as teachers, even during the war at Port Royal. None of that.
No, they have Buford. There's Buford, and there are images, for example, of Buford. But as I recall, they're not. The pictures largely of the schools are really post-war images.
Okay. And Susan, did you want to add something, perhaps about the stories?
Yeah, I was going to say, Charlotte Fortin publishes about teaching during the Civil War, former slaves. But, I kind of think of it as Black women are not seen as actual individuals. They're seen as, laborers or, something, where white women are often, their images, them reading a letter from their husband, and feeling sad, or, they're shown very emotionally involved. And African American women just aren't really shown that way in the press at the time. So I think that becomes a real sort of difference in how we view them.
Carol Walker's art focuses on how, excuse me, African Americans were sidelined or stereotyped in Harper's pictorial histories telling of the war. How much did market considerations influence those depictions, Josh? I mean, didn't they have Southern subscribers that they needed? Could that have shaped the way that they reported on this, or Southern consumers?
That's a good question, and I don't have a solid answer. Harper's is not the only publication. Frank Leslie's also has post-war compendia that also seems to lead women and African Americans to a great extent. So my supposition entirely is that some conception is that, particularly after the war's over, when they are desperate to retain their readership, the Civil War, for all intents and purposes, allows at least two of the weekly pictorial publications to not only prosper but to survive, which had not taken place in the United States previously. There had been experiments before that had collapsed within a year or two. But after the war, the public has less of an interest in the pictorial press. So to some extent, I could see the motivation would be to try to sell to the South. Having said that, except for showing Southern locations and of course battles, the book is hardly a pro Confederacy publication. So it's a sort of interesting question about how it was marketed. I mean, this is the perfect stuff for some future dissertation or researcher to try to figure out, well, what is the marketing of books like this, particularly once I say this advisedly, the country is reunited.
Susan raised a very good point about how African American women were depicted. How common were racial and ethnic stereotypes in Leslie's and Harper's, and how might this have figured into notions of who were rightfully citizens, building on Susan's comments? Josh, you want to answer that?
Sure. it's complex and complicated. There's no question that I would say the norm are stereotypes. I have to say the norm of a lot of the depictions of people in the illustrated press is either it can be viewed as stereotypes or as typing per se. In other words, in many ways, the pictorial press operates as a social map for their readers. And I have to say the readership of Harper's Weekly is more firmly middle class than Frank Leslie's, which has a wider expanse in terms of the society of readers. But I think that's that's one aspect of it, that African Americans are not the only people being stereotyped. The Irish, for example, Harper's Weekly vision of the Irish is
Terrible.
hardly complimentary, and certainly Thomas Nast's cartoons are, I mean, he hated the Irish and Irish Catholics. Having said that, there is clearly, amidst the stereotypes, there are very, very surprising images, both during the war and after the war. Images, by the way, we were just talking about schools, of African-American schools, the construction of schools after the war. As time goes on, there are other images as well. And in the sense that I think one could say that the very fact that these were subscription-driven publications, this is before the era of commercial advertising supporting magazines, and they were much more sensitive to their readership's response, and readers complained. And also because it was the publication that is Harper's Weekly of the Republican Party, we have unfortunately we don't have archives that have letters that are sent and so on and so forth. If we're lucky, it's commented on in these publications. But there have a very strong sense, and certainly evidence after the Civil War, of readers complaining, and also the organizations. And I would assume this would be true of abolitionist organizations that would do the same.
One last question. David Blight has written about the futile efforts of the great African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass to preserve the memory of the Civil War as a fight to end slavery. How do journals like Harper's and Leslie's shape the public's understanding of the gendered meaning of the war by century's end? Were slaves the only ones who were written out of the record during the post-Civil War era of reconciliation? And what did this mean in terms of citizenship? I'm going back to your comments about, Josh, about the content of Harper's Weekly. That seems to be the beginning of the masculinization of the memory of the war, and yet both you and Susan have mentioned that there were stories about women in the leading news magazines and a lot of articles about women's valor and women's contributions to the war. What is that like at the end of the century? Are the depictions primarily still of women and their sacrifices during the war?
Are we saying well, I should say that a number of publications, and this is not only the ones we've been talking about, but for example, the Century magazine, which was first the Atlantic Monthly and became the Century magazine, which is an extremely successful post-Civil War publication. I believe it's in 1884, begins a series of illustrations of the Civil War, done by former special artists who were the artists who went out and sketched the basis for the engravings that we've seen, called Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, and that's exactly what most of those images were. And this went on for quite a number of issues and was eventually published as a book. So to answer your question in terms of by the 1880s, there is a deletion of women's role. Now there is coverage of women for example, there are, although often until the 1880s, fairly hostile images of suffragists, for example. There are also images of women in breaking out or breaking through the glass ceiling of the time. Women doctors, the professionalization of the training of women doctors, for example, is one that comes immediately to mind. But there's a fair number that, particularly after Mrs. Frank Leslie takes over the publication after Frank Leslie dies in 1880.
Absolutely. And suddenly you're getting articles about Emily Roebling, and we need more better paid female doctors. She's quite wonderful, actually. And I keep wondering how she got away with that in a national news magazine with a general readership, because it wasn't a ladies' magazine. So it's quite remarkable. But that's fodder for another session. Susan, do you want to add anything on that or not?
I mean, I think when we look at the Civil War, women's magazines basically ignore the war. Like, you can go through most of Godey's Ladies' Book, and 2 or 3 issues in a row will have virtually no mention of the war. And yet then they'll mention a few things, but it's very, very kind of distant. Newspapers at the time, what did they say about women's roles? Well, the Richmond bread riot was highly written about, and illustrations were done of the women rioting. But it wasn't really what was seen as appropriate feminine activity. And so, a lot of the press, I think, either viewed women as sort of passive and kind or inappropriate. And with a few exceptions, when they would run stories about nurses, there wasn't a lot about women. And I think after the war, as Josh says, I mean, they kind of further move women out. And so the focus becomes on the battles and all themselves, as opposed to the importance of the home front.
Great. I think it's time for us to open it up for questions from the audience. And I see we have a first question. Did the cost of newspapers shape their readership? Who was the target audience of the penny press versus more expensive weekly and monthly magazines? That sounds like a question for you, Josh.
Yes, the pictorial publications were comparatively more expensive, but a good deal of there were many ways that people who could not afford these publications, working people in particular, were able to see these publications by group subscriptions, association subscriptions, subscriptions in libraries. It was unions, for example, trade unions would subscribe, and members would then be able to go and read the newspapers there. In almost every case, the newspapers, Frank Leslie's and Harper's Weekly, were posted on newsstands and stores for the public to see. So people who could not even afford the publication could look at the images online. And then finally, and just in terms of the soldiers during the war, the papers were very, very popular. They would be able to buy them if they were not mailed to them by relatives. They were able to buy them from traveling sutlers, and then they would pass them. It's well known that they would pass to their comrades, and as one description, I think, of a British reporter said, they would be basically in tatters by the time it had reached the last person. So there were many ways that people who could not afford these expensive or comparatively expensive publications could see them.
And that was even true before the war with the anti-slavery press. It was widely, distributed that way. And so, one person would subscribe, but they would give it to another family member, who would give it to a neighbor. And so, that was kind of a long tradition for newspapers in the 1830s and 40s, and apparently during the war itself.
So that when we have figures that suggest that Godey's Ladies book had a peak subscription list at 250,000 subscribers, you can actually multiply that by 10 to get a better sense of
Oh, yeah.
how people were reading it. That's amazing.
I mean,
Interesting.
I always think of, with Godey's, it was distributed amongst, neighbors, as they would, get the, you subscribe, you would read the articles and look at the lovely paintings of picture, of dresses and all, and then pass it to someone else. And I don't know if anyone has read these or remembers them, but even in Little House on the Prairie books, they talk about how their mother gets them from a neighbor. And then, they're looking at how to make a dress, it might be 6 months after the magazine's been published, but it eventually gets to them in South Dakota. So
we have a second question. This is a tough question. Oh, a very good one, though. Were there any pamphlets or publications that focused on assisting Confederate women who had to deal with the embargoes on certain goods?
To be perfectly frank, I have no idea.
So you haven't seen any, tips for getting around the embargo in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper?
Well, it wouldn't. They certainly by 1861, they're not pandering to the South. The one thing to keep in mind is that as the war progresses, there are less and less publications in the South.
Mhm.
Because of not only because of the embargo, there just simply are not resources. And if you're talking about images, they don't have engravers, most of whom would be up north. So I looked at the Confederate imprint collection, which is a terrific collection in Boston Athenaeum. Right after the war, they sent their minions down from Boston to buy up and grab whatever Southern publications they could that existed. And I've only taken a cursory look at it, but it's mainly official government publications. And I certainly have not remembered seeing anything that was that specific in terms of household tips in terms of dealing with the embargo.
And in Southern newspapers, they did cover the embargoes. They did have recipes for how to cure meats without salt. How to do, they would be not long articles, but they would be little bits and pieces of giving advice. And there's, even a Confederate cookbook that's a compilation of the various recipes and articles that have been published during the war. I think it comes out in 1963. And, it is, some of it, you would assume nothing, there wasn't a war, but some of the recipes are very specific about, well, here's how you make blank, since we can't, we don't have access to the food. I suspect there's more somewhere. I've looked and I haven't found it, but I'm hoping to delve into this more for my next book.
And Susan, we have a question for you. What other obligations besides homemaking did women's cultural citizenship entail? Child rearing, certainly, but is there something you'd like to talk about beyond that?
I think I think sort of the ideas of domesticity is most important, but remember, white women don't tend to keep their own houses, even in the North. They have, the Irish women come in, they have servants, but the idea that you can manage your servants and manage your household is how you create this sense of citizenship or nation building. But it's also things like, is a woman good and pious? Is she pure? Is she submissive? I was reading an article to give to my class last week, and I just kind of skimmed through it, and it was written in the 1850s, and Fanny Fern was the author, and it talks about a husband trying to ask tell his wife to just quit being friends with someone, that her woman friend is inappropriate, and he doesn't want her to spend time with her. And when he comes home, he doesn't see, he sees that she's gone. He doesn't know what to do, but then she shows up and she's like, no, I've been here, and, I respect what you have to say. And says, if you love a man enough, it's worth sacrificing your friends for. And I was like, I wasn't expecting that end in the 1850s in a women's magazine, but they're still, arguing for the idea of being submissive, at least to the head of their own household.
We've got 5 minutes left and one more question. How did literacy affect the content of newspapers? Were they designed for non-readers or for those who shared them in communal spaces? And Josh, this certainly goes to the illustrations, I think.
Sure. Although, of course, in the North, literacy was very, very high, certainly higher than it is today. So to begin with, there's I think that the very, very notion, the tendency is for us aficionados of the illustrated press to think of the images alone, but there's an awful lot of text in these publications. And it's also interesting to see how the two both complement the text and the images, contradict and complement each other. But I raise that because I think that is a supposition that certainly Harper's Weekly, which is much more of a middle class publication, is taking for granted that their readership is literate in English. Now, having said that, just to keep in mind, there are foreign, in quotation like language, illustrated publications in the United States at that period of time. Frank Leslie's has a German version, and it has for a while a Spanish version. So they're certainly taking into account that there's a market, and of course Germans were the largest immigrant group to the United States. And in terms of, we don't have any figures and specific figures in terms of the market, in terms of where subscribers were, but it's pretty clear that they were looking toward an immigrant, population that were going to be reading the newspaper.
And, I found for African Americans in the 1830s and 40s that either in Sunday schools or their literary groups, they would read articles, out loud. And so even the non-literate women in these groups could understand and follow because someone would read them to them. And so, in the 1830s, you might have a group of people that have just recently become, free in the last 25 years. And so, they may not know how to read. And so that's one way that a lot of the information gets spread from the press at the time.
To complement what Susan is saying, there are certain crafts that cigar makers, which sounds quite elite, but in fact was a major industry in the 19th century. Cigar makers had a tradition of people, of one of the cigar makers reading aloud to the other cigar makers when this was a handmade product. And there were other there are other trades that working class trades that in fact, and particularly crafts trades that did this, had the same sort of tradition of reading out loud.
Great. I want to thank both of you for a very interesting session. I want to thank the Center for Women's History for coordinating this salon and the New York Historical Society. And I especially want to thank our wonderful audience who gave us such good questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.